It was originally conceived as a United States of Europe. The European Union was created to bind its member nations together economically, politically, and socially. And in the 50 years since it was founded, the EU has progressed, stumbled, and grown, both in membership and influence. So why then are some nations clamoring to be members while others want little to do with the EU? And how do all those countries with different languages, politics, and customs get along with each other? We'll look at these and other issues next on Great Decisions.
In a democracy, agreement is not essential, but participation is. Join us as we discuss today's most critical global issues. Join us for Great Decisions. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association, inspiring Americans to learn more about the world.
Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation and U.S. Trust.
In the wake of World War II, amid the devastation in Europe, there was desire among members of the fractured continent to establish institutions that would bind them together, to ensure peace and prosperity, mainly through economic stability. In 1957, with 6 members, the European Economic Community was born. For several decades, the EEC was primarily an economic forum, but eventually the organization would be renamed the European Union. And after the Cold War ended, the EU began thinking about a common foreign policy for Europe. In the 50 years since its founding, membership has grown to 27 member states.
What the Europeans have been able to accomplish under the flag of the European Union, and before that the European Community, and before that the Steel and Coal Community, and so forth and so on, is unprecedented in history.
In that time, we've witnessed the creation of a European Parliament, a European Common Market, more recently a single currency, the euro, which has outperformed the US dollar for the past 5 years. And now, taken as a whole, the European Union is the world's largest economy, boasting 35% of the world's GDP, ahead of the United States.
This has given tremendous opportunity, but also tremendous security to Europeans, something they didn't enjoy in previous generations.
But what does this phenomenal growth and economic power mean for the European people? The answer is complicated. It means different things to different people. In the U.S., no matter what state you live in, everyone pays bills with dollars. Everyone is equally bound by a single constitution with its common rights and responsibilities. And Americans are all held to the same federally regulated interest rates and other economic regulations. The European Union, on the other hand, operates more like a buffet, with member states free to adopt some EU institutions and practices while ignoring others. Take the euro, for example. The EU's common currency has only been adopted by 13 of the 27 member states. The interest rates of these 13 are all set by the European Central Bank, yet other EU members have pegged their own currency to the euro. There is also the case of the European Constitution. Just 16 member states have ratified it, while others have put it off, or in the case of France and the Netherlands, have rejected it outright. All of this means that the EU is still very much clearly under construction. What is the ultimate goal? Is it a United States of Europe, or a more loosely organized federation where members retain considerable autonomy? And in the meantime, who benefits most from these institutions? And why are outsiders like Turkey so eager to get in? European Union at 50. Next on Great Decisions.
And now from our New York studios, here is Ralph Begleiter.
Welcome to Great Decisions. Joining us to help figure out the future of the European Union after its 50 years in existence are T.R. Reid, former Washington Post London bureau chief and author of The United States of Europe, the New Superpower and the End of American Supremacy, and Charles Kupchan, senior fellow for European Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations here in New York. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Tom, end of American supremacy? Is the European Union that kind of a threat to the United States?
Well, I think economically the European Union is a threat. I mean, let's take a look at Microsoft. The U.S. Justice Department tried to get Microsoft to rewrite Windows and failed. Brussels went after Microsoft and they rewrote Windows because Europe told them to. They have economic clout in the world. The Europeans are making most of the rules that govern commercial trade around the world now, because it's a huge market and they like rules, they're Europeans. So yeah, they have that kind of clout. They give away more money to more countries than the United States does. Let's assume Europe does that because they're nice people, but you buy power by doing that. You buy clout in the world. And
give away more money, you mean foreign aid?
Yes, foreign aid, both not military, but development aid they give to more countries in higher numbers. You get clout that way. Excuse me. About 80% of the members of the United Nations are getting money from the European Union. No wonder it's hard for us to pass something there that we don't like. So, yeah, I would say certainly in economic terms and kind of cultural terms, Europe has clout in the world today. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1990 or so, about 35 new constitutions have been written. There's not one that has a Congress and a president and a Supreme Court like ours. They're all modeled on European constitutions because that's the model that the rest of the world is trying to follow.
Charles, you agree? End of American supremacy? Is Europe a new superpower?
I agree with Tom that in the economic realm, the EU is clearly rivaling the United States. It has a market of some 500 million people. The euro has been gaining ground against the dollar. It's becoming a second reserve currency. But on geopolitical issues, the EU has not risen to the occasion, is no match for the United States. There has yet to be an effort to forge a single voice, a common unified position on foreign and security policy. The separate members of the EU are not yet ready to merge how they procure weapons, how they deploy forces. And until that happens, EU will remain, I think, underperforming on the security front, clearly trying to get more engaged diplomatically, not there in terms of deployable force.
Great Decision spoke with Strobe Talbot, who is the president of the Brookings Institution and a former Time magazine reporter. Let's listen to what he has to say.
I think that we'll see a new degree of energy and some fresh thinking. And I hope a reaffirmation of commitment both to the European project, making the most of the European Union, and also to the central importance of the transatlantic relationship. There is no contradiction whatsoever, or at least there shouldn't be any contradiction, between having a strong and increasingly stronger European Union and having strong ties to the United States.
Do you agree with that? No contradiction. You could be a superpower or a challenging superpower without threatening the United States, Charles?
Well, in some ways, the Iraq War, even though it was very divisive for the transatlantic community, provided, I think, a process of learning whereby both Americans and Europeans realized that if the two sides of the Atlantic go their separate ways, it could be very negative for both. And the Iraq War sort of divided Europe. You had the British, the Spanish, the Italians that backed President Bush. You had the French and the Germans that led the charge against the war in Iraq. And there was a sense that perhaps the transatlantic relationship was coming to an end. It's interesting that Schroeder and Chirac are gone. You now have Angela Merkel in Germany, Nicolas Sarkozy in France, both of whom are more pro-American, more pro-Atlanticist. And so rather than seeing the EU emerge as a counterweight to American power, which is what the Germans and the French said during the initial years of the Iraq War, you now have European leaders who are saying a strong Europe and a strong America can be partners. And the Bush administration as well, after a period of thinking, well, we don't need Europe, we don't need allies, has come around to saying, you know what, we're in trouble in Iraq, we need help in Iran, we need help in the Middle East peace process. Where do we get that help? The best place to look is the EU.
Are they looking to the EU, or are they looking to France and Germany, the heavyweights in Europe?
Some combination. Henry Kissinger always said, who do we call when we want to get someone on the horn in Europe? And there is an answer to some extent. There's Javier Solana, the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy, and he's trying to herd the cattle. On the other hand, if you call him, you also need to call Paris and London and Berlin, because decisions are made partly in Brussels, but partly in national capitals. It's a bit of a hybrid animal.
Tom, is it fair to say that the United States, when it looks to Europe, is looking to the European Union, or is it looking to individual nations and kind of totaling up the votes and the military power and the political power within Europe?
Well, George W. Bush was the first president of the United States of America to visit the capital, the headquarters of the United States of Europe, and I think in Brussels. And I think today the U.S. administration is dealing with Brussels and with the EU much more than ever before. Even in Bush's first term, they wanted to deal with Berlin, with London, with Dublin, with Paris. Now they're dealing with Brussels. You remember Rumsfeld famously said, former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld said, well, there's old Europe and new Europe. He wanted to divide Europe and get our... And the Europeans hated that. They didn't want to be divided by some American Secretary of Defense. And Secretary Rumsfeld went to Munich early in the second Bush administration. Somebody said, what's this about new Europe, old Europe? He said, well, you know, the guy who said that was the old Rumsfeld. Because now I think the U.S. is trying to deal with Europe as an entity.
Isn't really the nub of being a superpower about military power and foreign policy power and not about economic power? Tom?
Well, they're making a bet. I think the Europeans are making a very interesting gamble that they can be a superpower, a major force in the world without military power. If it takes military power, they won't do it because they're not in the military. They don't like it. They don't like the cost of it. But I think they're betting, yeah, they can be a political, economic, cultural force in the world without military power, and it'll be very interesting to see if that bet pays off.
Great Decision spoke with General Wesley Clark, who was the NATO military commander for a while, about the question of whether the U.S. and European military forces have been cooperative with one another. Let's hear what he has to say.
Well, basically, what we have now is we have a reaction force on the part of the European Union. We have a reaction force on the part of NATO. And then we have the national pools of forces, and many of these national pools support both the EU force and the NATO force. And people say they're training to common standards. The closer we can come to an integration of these capabilities, the stronger the transatlantic link will be, and the stronger we'll be.
European forces are actually working with the United States and have in a way taken over some of the responsibilities of the U.S. in Afghanistan, for example. Charles, talk a little bit about that relationship, that military-to-military relationship.
There was a theological debate in the 1990s, and it really ran up until the second term of the Bush administration about whether a strong EU and a strong NATO would be compatible. And the Clinton administration was sort of, don't rock the boat, invest money in the military, but don't go off on your own because that will undermine NATO. I think that debate is over. And there's a sense in Washington that the stronger the EU becomes militarily, the more it invests in being able to deploy forces alongside the United States, the better the relationship will be.
Does the European military, do the European militaries, plurals, have the kind of projection of force capability the United States has? And from the military standpoint, would you characterize the European Union as a superpower? Tom?
They don't have long-range bombers. France has one of these aircraft carriers that can launch a jet plane with a catapult, but they've never gotten it out to sea. Britain says they're going to build two, but nobody's got those tools for projecting power like the United States does. I'm not sure they want them.
Of course, two countries in the European Union have nuclear weapons, and that's certainly a force projection capability. Do you think the European Union will be ever given the power to politically control the use of those nuclear weapons?
Not for a long time, because that's sort of the final redoubt of sovereignty. Are the French and the British going to perhaps merge their seats in the UN Security Council for an EU seat? Maybe. It's hard for me to imagine that they're going to give the right to push the button to Brussels. But, you know, we're seeing incremental steps. There's a European Defense Agency. In the effort to create a European constitution, it's no longer called a constitution, it's a reform treaty. More power is being given to the so-called foreign minister. He's going to have his own diplomatic staff. He'll have a greater budget. So little by little, the EU is trying to aggregate its power, not unlike the United States did in the 19th century. And I think it's important to keep in mind that processes of integration, forming new political units from separate entities, is always slow, it's always difficult, that the EU is 50 and still doesn't have a common army doesn't mean, in my mind, that it's a failure. It's just working gradually toward the end of becoming a more capable union.
I was going to ask you the question about the UN Security Council seat. So you think that perhaps one day France and Britain will give up their seats on the UN and at the Security Council and make it a EU seat. Tom, do you see that coming?
Well, if you buy their rhetoric, they should. That's the logical result of this unifying Europe, but I can't see it myself.
Politically, it seems unlikely.
I bet you 30 years, 50 years from now, there's still 27 European embassies along Mass Avenue in Washington. I don't think they're going to come together. Logically, they should if you buy what they're saying, but I don't think they will.
So I want to hear from a moment from Ambassador John Bruton, who's from Ireland but is the European Union's ambassador to the United States, on this question of unanimity in foreign policy and defense policy. That's really the nub of what you've both been talking about in the restriction as a military and political superpower. John Bruton.
Now, unlike most areas of EU decision-making, where we can make decisions by a majority or a large majority vote, in the area of foreign policy, there must be unanimous agreement for any European foreign policy to be decided upon. And that can be obviously quite difficult where you have to get 27 countries to agree, some of whom have different political traditions. But we're working very hard on it. We're working very hard in particular in the area of the Middle East. We're working very hard in the area of development assistance, helping poorer countries to develop. The biggest donor of development assistance in the entire world to the poorer parts of the world is the European Union.
Tom Friedman, the New York Times columnist, once famously said that any political organization that needs an airplane hangar to meet in shouldn't be viewed as any kind of a strong political force. And the point Ambassador Bruton was just making is getting 27 people to agree on whether to push the nuclear button or whether to give up a seat at the United Nations or take any kind of military or defense kind of policy decision is a long way off.
I think there are two different trends. One is that over the last 3, 4, 5 years, there has been a process of renationalization taking place in Europe. Power is going back to some extent to the national state.
From Brussels to the individual capitals.
And I think that's in part because of globalization. And there's a sense inside, especially those countries like Italy, France, and Germany that still have large state sectors that are fighting to preserve the welfare state. They're kind of pushing back, partly because of Muslim immigration, which is very controversial. The European states are not doing a good job of bringing in Muslims and bringing them into the social mainstream. But at the same time, I think you're seeing Europe move to a model of decision-making, particularly on the issues you're talking about, hard power, of going towards small groups, 4, 5, 6 countries getting together and moving more quickly than the Union as a whole. So, for example, if you say, who's been negotiating with Iran on its nuclear program, it's the EU3, the big powers, plus Javier Solana. If you say, who's been dealing with the Balkans, it's the contact group, a small number of countries. So I think that even as we see the EU get bigger and more sort of renationalized, you will also see a pattern of small groups coming together precisely because they know that it's difficult to get a consensus with the EU as a whole.
Tom, did you want to comment on that?
I don't buy that because I think Europe has come so much further than anybody would have dreamed back in '57 when they signed the Treaty of Rome. If I'd been reporting that and I said this is going to lead to one Europe where you can travel from the Med to the Arctic Circle without ever seeing a border guard and without ever changing currency, they would have said I was nuts. Now that's standard. Everybody just takes it for granted. So I think this Europe is here to stay. I think it's worked for most Europeans, and they're going to stick with it.
But, Tom, you can't travel from the Mediterranean in Turkey to the Baltic or to the North Atlantic without seeing a border guard, and that pertains to Charles's point about Muslim immigration. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Sure.
Turkey's trying to get into the EU and been trying for a long, long time. The Europeans are very, very reluctant. Why?
Well, I think a lot of it is they're afraid of all those Muslims coming in, and they're afraid of all those low-paid Turkish job seekers coming in and taking their jobs. That's what they're worried about. They're not sure they can assimilate this. Quite similar, I think, to the kind of revolution against immigration in the United States. It's a powerful force. So that's why they're worried about it. And, of course, it's a matter of geography, Ralph. 2% of Turkey is in Europe. You could argue it's an Asian country. But, again, if you take their rhetoric...
It's a NATO ally, though.
Yeah, if you take their rhetoric
alliance.
that we should all work together, have a borderless alliance, Turkey ought to be in there, but I think it's going to be a long time before it happens.
Is that related to a fear of a religious issue, or is it a jobs issue in Europe? Germany already has lots of Turkish immigrants. That may be one of the big political issues in Germany at the moment.
They
is it
go
related
to Turkish
terrorism?
language schools now. Yeah, that it is a political issue in Germany. I think it's both. There's some sense that there's this religious minority that doesn't share our traditions is growing in our cities, and there's some sense that these people are going to come in and take our jobs. I think both of those, not unlike the reaction to immigration throughout American history.
The one flip side of this is that the EU member states realize that their populations are declining, that they have low birth rates, and that if they're going to keep their populations and pension systems afloat, they need warm bodies. Where are their warm bodies? Well, they're not in Central Europe and they're not in Russia because birth rates are low there. They're in Turkey, North Africa, the Middle East, where you have a youth bulge. And that means more and more Muslims are coming in. And I think at heart, this is not an economic issue. It's an issue of identity and religion. And the problem across the EU, unlike here in the United States, is that ethnicity and nationhood are still intermingled. And so even though someone might say, I'm a Frenchman and the person who's an immigrant from Algeria is a French citizen, they may not be thinking in the back of their mind that that person is really a Frenchman with French blood running through his or her veins. And until that mindset shifts, I think there'll be resistance to opening the door to Turkey and to bringing more and more Muslims in because there's a sense that they're not us. And then, as you mentioned, there's the terrorism issue. We've seen bombs in Madrid, bombs in London, averted attacks in Germany. There's a sense that Muslim communities represent a threat from within.
Do the Europeans see that terrorism theme as something that unites them with the United States, or do they try to separate themselves from the United States on that score to try to avoid the kind of anti-American terrorism which has been occurring in recent years? Tom?
Well, after 9/11, we're all Americans now, as you remember. Lamont famously said, yeah, everybody was on our side and we were all fighting terrorism together. I think more Europeans have died in Afghanistan than Americans have. So on that side of terrorism, they're with us. But as soon as we invaded Iraq, we kind of lost that support. They don't think that's part of any war on terror, and they're not with us on it.
Is that a dividing factor as they consider expansion, for example, to Turkey and perhaps elsewhere? Do they see that through the terrorism lens? I guess you sort of touched on it, Charles.
They do, and as Tom said, the Iraq war has been very polarizing in the sense that in Spain, after the Madrid bombings of the railroad there, they withdrew from Iraq because there was a sense that this is why we're being attacked. On the other hand, when you do have threats in major European cities, there is a sense that this pushes EU closer to the U.S., and in tangible terms it does. There's more sharing of intelligence. There's now sharing of who's on airplanes going across the Atlantic, more effort to freeze the assets of al-Qaeda operatives. But yes, there's no question that this does create a vicious cycle. The dominant populations say, look, these Muslims, they represent a threat. They're extremists. That creates alienation within the Muslim communities in Europe, and then it's a self-reinforcing cycle.
I want to turn in the last moments of our program to a kind of cultural issue and just hear you briefly on this subject. I think something like 3/4 of the revenues in movie houses in Europe comes from American films being shown in European movie theaters. And yet there's a resistance to that in the European Union. They want to be able to promote European filmmakers, and not just film, but music and poetry and literature and so on as well. That's another area where I think there's tension between the United States and the European Union. Is that a serious issue? They want to watch our films, but they want to be able to produce more of their own. Tom?
You know, the French are concerned about preserving French culture against the American wave. You go down the street in Paris, everybody you pass is wearing Nikons, drinking Starbucks, and listening to 50 Cent or Beyonce on her iPod. Everybody. This is beyond governments in Europe. They love American culture. It's taken over, and if the French government can't stop it.
Charles, you have a last word on that subject?
No question that Tom's right about the movies and the Nikes and the jeans, but there is, I think, a big question out there, and that is, are we witnessing a generational change that will have political and strategic consequences? The generation that lived through World War II and the rebuilding of Europe was very pro-American. For them, the alliance across the Atlantic was sacred. For younger Europeans, let's say 2025, they're coming of age amid terrorism, amid the Iraq War. It's uncertain whether they will look to the United States as a partner in the long run or simply as yet another state with whom they have no special affinity. And it remains to be seen where this new generation of younger Americans as well as Europeans take this relationship.
Charles Kupchan, Senior Fellow for European Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and T.R. Reid, former Washington Post London Bureau Chief and author of The United States of Europe. Thank you both for joining us on Great Decisions. And thank you as well for being with us on Great Decisions. I'm Ralph Begleiter.
To learn more about topics discussed on Great Decisions, visit our website at www.greatdecisions.org. To order a copy of the Great Decisions Briefing Book, a DVD set of this series, or to join a Great Decisions discussion group in your area, contact the Foreign Policy Association. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation and U.S. Trust.